It's very delicious to act with beautiful men. Al Pacino, Robert Redford. These are the ones I haven't been able to work with yet.
Hollywood remembers Dean Martin one way. Angie Dickinson remembers him another. After decades of silence, the legendary actress is finally opening up about the man she knew away from the cameras, and what she revealed has surprised even longtime fans. So who was Dean Martin when the spotlight disappeared? And why is Angie Dickinson's story so different from the one the public has believed for years?
Dude.
What would you like to do?
Anything you want.
Join us as we uncover the extraordinary truth behind one of Hollywood's most unforgettable friendships. The girl from North Dakota. Angeline Brown was born in Kulm, North Dakota, a small agricultural town in the middle of the country that had approximately zero connection to Hollywood glamour and was not the kind of place that produced movie stars by any obvious logic. Her family moved to Burbank, California when she was a girl, which at least put her in the same state as the studios, though still an enormous distance from anything that resembled the entertainment industry in a practical sense. She got into acting the way a lot of women of her generation got into it, sideways, through a beauty contest. After finishing at Immaculate Heart College, she entered a local pageant and took second place. That was enough to get her an appearance on the Colgate Comedy Hour in 1953. That appearance was enough to convince her that this was worth pursuing seriously. She started doing what every aspiring actor did in early 1950s television, showed up for small roles in anthology series, learned her craft under conditions that were not particularly forgiving, built a body of work that was less about individual performances and more about simply being reliable and visible enough that directors kept calling. Her first marriage, to football player Gene Dickinson in 1952, gave her the surname she kept for the rest of her career. She was 20 when she married him, and by the time they divorced in 1960, she had left Angeline Brown far enough behind that Angie Dickinson was no longer a stage name, but simply who she was. So, while the marriage ended, the name stayed. And the career, which had been building steadily through the mid-1950s in television westerns and small film roles, was about to arrive at the moment that changed everything. That moment had a title, Rio Bravo, and the man who made it possible was Dean Martin. So what actually happened between Angie Dickinson and Dean Martin on the set of one of the most beloved westerns ever made? The answer reveals something about Dean Martin that his own mythology spent decades obscuring. The set where everything changed. In 1959, director Howard Hawks cast Angie Dickinson opposite John Wayne and Dean Martin in Rio Bravo. For Angie, the opportunity was enormous, and the circumstances were intimidating. John Wayne was her childhood idol. He was also, by 1959, arguably the most famous movie star in the world, a man whose very presence on set reorganized the atmosphere around him. She was terrified of him, by her own admission. She had to play scenes opposite John where her character was the person in charge of the moment. She described it decades later as not easy, that it would have been considerably simpler if the script had let John Wayne be the dominant one, because that would at least have felt natural. Dean Martin was different. He was already well known through his partnership with Jerry Lewis. By the time Rio Bravo began shooting, the duo had been one of the most successful comedy acts in America throughout the 1950s before their split in 1956. But where John Wayne's stardom had a gravitational quality that altered the room, Dean's stardom had a different texture. He was warm, relaxed, and in Angie's description, a darling man. She had known him slightly before the film, through his restaurant on Sunset Boulevard, but not closely. Rio Bravo changed that, She told Closer Weekly in 2024 exactly how she remembered him on that set. Everyone only had a great relationship with Dean. He was that easygoing, friendly Gemini cool cat. She described how funny he was, how welcoming, how he made her feel at ease during her scenes in a way that the circumstances, a young woman sharing a set with John Wayne, for heaven's sake, did not naturally produce. He was a very funny man who always made her laugh on set, and they became close friends. Not a casual set friendship that dissolved when production wrapped, but a real one, the kind that meant she was close with his wife. The kind that meant when Dean Martin died in 1995, she rode to his funeral in the car with his wife Gian. But the detail that Angie revealed about Dean Martin in that Fox News interview, the one that was genuinely unexpected, given how thoroughly the public had absorbed the opposite narrative, was this: he never had a drink in his adulthood. He faked all that drunkenness. The persona he was known for, the swaying, the slurring, the trademark glass of scotch that had become as much his signature as his voice, was a performance. And the woman who became one of his closest friends across the years that followed confirmed it with the particular authority of someone who had actually been in the room. That revelation deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it changes the entire story of who Dean Martin actually was. So what was really going on behind the most famously boozy persona in entertainment history? The greatest act in show business. The drunk was the brand. By the time Dean Martin settled into his role as the Rat Pack's indispensable counterweight to Frank Sinatra in the early 1960s, the perpetually tipsy lounge singer had become so embedded in his public identity that most of America took it entirely at face value. He swayed, he sipped, he made jokes about needing another drink. Nancy Sinatra, who grew up watching both her father and Martin operate at close range, felt strongly enough about the misconception to address it publicly on social media, writing plainly that Dean was very disciplined, that he golfed every morning, and that the drinking was part of the professional persona. It was just an act. His backup singer, Patty Gribbo, confirmed the same thing to multiple outlets across the years. The famous glass was often apple juice or iced tea. The slurring and the swaying were precisely calibrated for maximum audience response and required exactly the kind of discipline that genuine intoxication would have made impossible to sustain. What the act obscured was something that Angie Dickinson grasped at close range through years of genuine friendship. That underneath the stage persona was a man who was, in her telling to Terry Gross on Fresh Air, very much a loner. Not a loner in the sense of being unfriendly or cold, but a loner in the sense that while Frank Sinatra wanted a crowd around him at all hours and became unhappy without company, Dean wanted to go home. He liked his own space and pace. He liked, when the performance was done, to be somewhere quiet. That quality explained something that observers of the Rat Pack had sometimes found puzzling. The fact that Martin was simultaneously the group's most beloved figure in the eyes of the public, and in many ways the most peripheral member in terms of actual group participation. He showed up and performed. He was brilliant on stage with Frank Sinatra and Davis and Bishop. And what the audiences saw was real. The chemistry was genuine. The affection between him and the others was real. But he did not live the late-night lifestyle. He was not staying up until dawn with a crowd of people because he found it fulfilling. He was a man who had built a persona that bore very little resemblance to his actual temperament, which took a kind of discipline and distance from his own public image. Angie Dickinson was one of the people who knew the actual man rather than the performed one. The friendship they built on the set of Rio Bravo was built on that real person. The warm, funny, welcoming man who made her feel at ease on a set that was otherwise genuinely intimidating. And that friendship meant that when Martin appeared in Ocean's 11 the following year, alongside Frank Sinatra and the assembled Rat Pack, Angie was already not a newcomer to the world she was entering. She was a friend of Dean's, and through Dean's world, she eventually arrived at something considerably more complicated than friendship. Because also, in Ocean's 11 was a man she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The man she described, without qualification, as the love of her life. The love of her life, and the one she didn't marry. Ocean's 11 premiered in 1960 and crystallized the Rat Pack myth at a single moment. Frank Sinatra, Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Angie Dickinson filmed in Las Vegas while the core group performed every night at the Sands Hotel's Copa Room. The movie was almost incidental to what was happening in that city during its production. What was happening was the creation of a mythology that Las Vegas has been living off ever since. The idea of a group of impossibly glamorous, impossibly talented people who seemed to exist outside the ordinary rules that governed everyone else's life, who performed genius and laughed and drank and stayed up all night because they simply were that way. Angie was in the middle of it, not as a peripheral figure, but as a real participant in the social world that surrounded the filming. And somewhere in the orbit of that production, the attraction between her and Frank Sinatra moved from professional to something else. She has been disarmingly straightforward about it across decades of interviews, with none of the coy deflection that celebrities often deploy around romantic history. She called him the love of her life. She said she smiled when she thought about him because it felt good. She described him as an extraordinary talent and an extraordinary man, difficult, wonderful, brave, and foolish, in approximately that order. The relationship ran on and off for what she described to the New York Post in 2015 as 20 years, beginning at a 1953 appearance on the Colgate Comedy Hour and continuing across multiple phases of both their lives. They came very close to marrying in 1964. She has confirmed this plainly in multiple interviews. The late-night lifestyle was one obstacle. Frank was a creature of the small hours in a way that Angie, who was building her own career and her own life, found genuinely incompatible with how she wanted to live. The other obstacle was Nancy Sinatra, his ex-wife, for whom Angie expressed such genuine warmth and affection that the prospect of being the woman who replaced her in the formal sense was one she could not fully embrace. But that wasn't the only obstacle. Frank Sinatra apparently told her he would not marry an actress. She apparently accepted that as closing one kind of conversation while another kind continued. The romance had its chapters and its pauses and its resumptions. In 1965, Angie married Burt Bacharach, one of the most successful songwriters in American history, a man she described to CBS News as very different from anyone she had been with before. And different he was, in ways that turned out to matter more than the initial attraction promised. But the Frank feeling never entirely went away. In 2023, at a film festival, 91 years old and still formidably sharp, she was asked about Frank and said the same thing she had always said. He was the love of her life. She smiled because it felt good to think about him. That constancy, the willingness to carry something openly across 70 years without pretending it was less than it was, is one of the more striking qualities in a woman whose public persona was often reduced to her beauty and her roles. The inner life was considerably richer and more durable than the tabloid version of it suggested. But the real weight of Angie Dickinson's private life did not come from the romance. It came from something that arrived later, that required everything she had, and that she spoke about with the same directness she brought to everything else. And that something was her daughter Nikki, the daughter who needed everything. Angie and Burt Bacharach married in 1965 after a 10-week courtship that she described as having been impossible to summarize. He was so different. The composer who would go on to win 2 Academy Awards, who had written for Dionne Warwick and Dusty Springfield and Tom Jones, who was one of the defining musical voices of the 1960s, was unlike anyone she had been with in ways she found compelling, and that, as the years progressed, she found increasingly painful. Their daughter, Leah Nikki Bacharach, was born in 1966, 3 months premature, weighing 1 pound 10 ounces, spending the first 3 months of her life in an incubator. She survived, but the circumstances of her birth had effects that took years to fully understand. Nikki developed slowly in some areas, not speaking until she was 3, struggling with social interactions and sensory sensitivities in ways that were observable but not yet diagnosable in the 1960s and 70s, when the medical understanding of autism spectrum conditions was still in its infancy. The American Psychiatric Association did not include Asperger's syndrome in its diagnostic manual until 1994, when Nikki was already 27 years old. By then, what had been a lifetime of confusion about why she experienced the world the way she did had accumulated into something she could not manage on her own. Angie and Burt separated in 1976. The divorce, finalized in 1981, was not peaceful in the way that the exit from her first marriage had been. She told CBS News, with characteristic plainness, that he had never loved her the way one loves, that his love was in his own way, which was not too good, and that he had no respect for her. Burt's own memoir, published before his death in February 2023 at 94, acknowledged his infidelity during the marriage. The hurt in what Angie said about it, across multiple interviews across multiple decades, was real and unmistakable. After the separation, Nikki lived for 9 years at the Wilson Center, a psychiatric residential treatment facility in Faribault, Minnesota. Angie visited her there regularly, flying to Minnesota 4 or 5 times a year, taking Nikki on trips to the Canadian Rockies, the Tetons, the Yucatan. She described those trips in a piece for Los Angeles Magazine with the specific warmth of a mother who had found ways to be present under circumstances that most people would not know how to navigate. Nikki was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in her late 20s. The diagnosis gave language to what had always been present but never named, and Angie described it as providing some clarity while not providing the relief that clarity sometimes brings. Nikki could not cope, even knowing the name for what she was experiencing. The noise of the world, literally, physically, the noise, was too much. The complexity of navigating a life that her nervous system experienced as under constant assault was more than she could manage. She spoke openly near the end of her life about self-harm, and those around her, absorbing the statements over time, reached a point where the constancy of the talk made the possibility feel less immediate rather than more. On January 4th, 2007, Leah Nikki Bacharach died at 40 years old in her condo in Thousand Oaks, California. Her parents released a statement that was unusual in its directness, describing what had happened plainly, saying that Nikki had quietly and peacefully ended her life to escape what her condition had been doing to her. They wanted people to understand what Asperger's syndrome was, what it could do, how invisible and devastating it could be. One story ended in profound tragedy. The next begins with a revelation that quietly rewrote how millions of people understood one of Hollywood's biggest icons. So what did Angie Dickinson know about Dean Martin that the rest of the world largely misunderstood? What she said about Dean. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, at 78 years old, from acute respiratory failure caused by lung cancer he had declined to treat surgically. He had been largely reclusive in the years following the 1987 death of his son, Dean Paul Martin, in a plane crash, a loss that people close to him described as having taken something out of him that his characteristic ease could not restore. The Las Vegas Strip dimmed its lights in his honor when he died. The city that had made him synonymous with a specific idea of cool paid him the tribute that acknowledged what he had been to it. Angie Dickinson was at his funeral. She had known him since 1959, through the making of the film she considers the best of her career. She had been close with his wife. She had watched the private person operate at close range for decades while the public consumed the persona. And what she consistently offered about the private person, across every interview, across every film festival appearance, across every conversation where his name came up, was warmth. Perhaps Dean Martin's greatest performance wasn't pretending to be drunk. It was convincing the world they knew him. If Dean Martin's entire public persona, the drunk, the easygoing cool, the man who didn't care about anything, was a performance so complete that the world took it for reality for 4 decades, what does that tell us about how much of what we think we know about the people we admire is actually the work they put into appearing to be effortless? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.